Thanks very much, everybody, for coming to this webinar organized by my colleagues at the Global Development Institute. Um, Thank you especially for those from across the English Channel and Geneva. I hope you have all got my slides. If you haven't, please ask my colleague at the chat, and Skylar or Luisa will be happy to send you. I made the slides available before this webinar, so because I noticed that the audience spans a wide spectrum. I can only hope there is something in those slides for everybody. And if there isn't, now is the chance for you to ask questions to clarify things later on. Now, let's get on. Today, I want to share an ongoing work on the life course shaping of healthy aging on 30 countries in America, Britain, China, and Europe. Especially, I want to ask and answer the question whether growing up in poverty goes with growing old with multimorbidity. Few pictures are more endearing than babies and their grandparents. And this seems universal in the global north or in the global south. But for me, such pictures also encapsulate an conceptual framework, an important one, namely the life course shaping of health in aging societies. So my aim in doing this work is to study new social determinants of health in old age, in particular conditions when a person is raised, especially childhood poverty, or more completely, childhood material poverty. The second aim is to study epigenetic imprinting of childhood poverty as measured in rates of DNA methylation in representative population samples. And I want to do these studies in rich and middle-income countries to show that it happens around the world. So I assembled data from America, Britain, China, and 27 European countries. For the econometricians around you, I use nonlinear fixed effects models. I'm not going to spend much time on that, but that's the model that I'm using for this, with some finite mixture corrections. And the last aim is to illustrate the life course shaping of health in aging societies in the North and in the South. You may not be unaware of this. It's very familiar by now that populations are getting older. And if we look at just a decade ago and a few decades from now, we can see how the world on the left is transformed, getting more color, more shade, and darker on the right. So many more countries will have 30% of more people with 60 years of age and older. But the change from left to right is not uniform. If we look at the history of France, the very left on that arrow, it took more than 100 years to double the proportion of older people age 60 and older, from 10 to 20%. Whereas if you look at on the right arrows, China, for instance, will only have about 2 decades to experience a doubling of older people from 10 to 20%. So the velocity is much more rapid, much quicker in China, Brazil, and India. And I want to leave with you one English word that, if you get anything out of this an hour talk, is momentous. If you remember physics high schools, momentum is mass times velocity. What is happening here, you see, is just the velocity that what took France 100 years will take China only 2 decades. But also the mass of China is 5-fold than those of Europe. So what you see, if you look at the mass, the number of people times the velocity, the quickening of the pace of aging in China, the world indeed is facing a momentous change. So I begin to ask the questions, what social determinants shape the health of all this huge number of people in the North and in the South? And I'm interested in particular on their childhood experience. So I wrote this paper, Growing Up in Poverty, Growing Old in Infirmity. I use British data, the English longitudinal study of aging. I will spend some time here. This starts back in 2008, about 3,000 British people aged exactly 50 years old, because they were members of the National Child Development Study Cohort 1958. In 1958, in some sunny spring, not unlike today in Manchester, in a few weeks, all pregnant women were contacted, and they become part of the National Child Development Studies 1958. The mothers and the newborns were collected for information from them, and they were followed up when they were born, when they were a few months old, when they were 1 year old, 5 years old, 10 years old, and so on, until in 2008, they were 50 years old. So we have what is the traditional British cohort study. And in 2008, when they were 50 years old, they were asked two simple questions. How many people were in the house when you were 10 years old? How many rooms were the house have when you were 10 years old? Very simple. How many people and how many rooms? And you can guess, of the nearly 3,000 50-year-old British people, how many got that two questions correct? I'm not going to ask you to raise hands or put it in the chat, but I can tell you only 1 in 3 got them right. And so recollection of simple observations 40 years earlier is subject to recall error and recall bias. How did I know what's the correct answer? Well, because the mothers were visited 40 years earlier, and the house was checked, and the kids and the mother were checked as well. So the point when beginning to study this, I found that retrospective or recall information are subject to huge error, and inference, ignoring those errors, are not safe at all. So that's my motivation, partly in devising two methods to solve this in order to arrive at my final aim, understanding growing up in poverty, whether it also means growing old in infirmity. So I'll show you the evidence later, but my conclusion, therefore, is it does matter. And a deeper understanding of population health, especially older population health, can only be reached if their childhood conditions are considered. I'll show you some examples. This is gait speed, a measure of muscle function. This is episodic memory, a measure of cognitive function. And this is mental health, depression. I'll sum it up here. The most important thing to remember is the middle block, bias corrected. There are 3 of them: gait, speed, episodic memory, and mental health, all to the left of the vertical dashed line, which means gait, speed, episodic memory, and mental health are worse in the childhood poor. I then move on based on that finding and that methods to deal with recall error and recall bias in retrospective information. I expand it to understand health, not only in Britain, but in America and 26 European countries. Not only expanding geographically, I also go deeper into the epigenome under the skin. So I'll show you evidence of epigenetics later on. In America, Britain, and Europe, the connection between childhood poverty and late life health can be understood in terms of epigenetics. But I will show you some evidence first. Here is depression in 28 countries that I mentioned earlier. So if you look at the top left is Britain, Austria, Germany, Sweden, Netherlands, Switzerland, that's the first row, and so on. I'm not going to read all to you, but the last one is America. Consistently, I use the red dashed lines to mark those who are childhood poor, and the continuous green line to mark those who were childhood non-poor. As you can see, depression are more prevalent, higher probability among those who are childhood poor. I'm not going to show you the confidence intervals. Trust me, it is significant. I hope you have seen the slides, and at the end of that, there are lots and lots and lots and lots of long tables. It's something like that here. So, for instance, the top left, in Britain, there is a marked difference between those who are childhood poor and those who were childhood non-poor. More depression among the childhood poor. Similarly in America too. Another thing that you see here is variation across countries. There is no surprise there, but it is nevertheless reassuring. Countries differ in the level and slopes of depression in older people. That's depression. How about sarcopenia? Sarcopenia is a measure of muscle function. There is a working group in Europe that has a definition of this. I'm not going to bore you with the definition, but it is a measure of muscle function. And you would not be surprised to expect that those who are childhood poor also have more sarcopenia. Sarcopenia is not a good thing. So those who are childhood poor have red dashed line above the green continuous line all throughout the 28 countries that I looked at. And as you can see, there are variations in levels and in slopes across country. As I mentioned earlier in the very first slide, this is nonlinear fixed effects model. So it captures health variations across countries. For instance, the top left has got the NHS, the bottom right has got the primarily private sector healthcare in America. The last one is episodic memory. Remember, episodic memory is good thing. So you see the continuous green line is above the red dashed line. So those who were childhood non-poor have better episodic memory throughout all the 28 countries that I studied. And as you can see also, there are variations in levels and slopes across these countries, reflecting the fact that these countries have very different histories, health systems, cultures, and so on. Now, those were the last, the results from last year. You can read them in the Handbook of Health Inequalities Across the Life course. If you want the chapter, just ask Skylar and Louisa, and I'll happily send you the chapter. I move on now to include China because I want to show you the momentous change that I mentioned earlier. A country that is aging much more rapidly than all the countries that I have shown you so far, and the countries that are also much larger than all those countries that I have shown you so far. And as you can see, I have an extra column of childhood indicators here. Remember earlier, I mentioned about the number of rooms when you were 10, the number of books when you were, the number of people when you were 10. What was asked in these surveys are these questions. I'll read them to you. The first column is the survey called the US Health and Retirement Survey. The second column is the survey called English Longitudinal Study of Aging. The third column is the China Health and Retirement Longitudinal Study. And the last column is the Survey of Health, Aging and Retirement in Europe. I'll show you the numbers that I am using in my study later on when I show you the evidence. And in America, they ask different sets of questions than in Britain, than in China, than in Europe. So I'll lay them out to you. There are some similarities, but some difference too. So number of room, number of books, whether someone was fostered or whether the grandparent looked after them, or whether they lived outside the US when they were 10 or 11. In Britain, in addition to the number of room and the number of books when they grew up at age 10 or 11, whether they had cold running water or hot running water, whether they had indoor toilet, fixed bath, central heating, and so on. And in China, it's different. Of course, you wouldn't want to ask whether they had central heating. It's a different set of questions. Whether they have family members starving to death during the Great Leap Forward, whether Auntie Lee or Uncle Wei starved to death when they were a child, whether they experienced financial hardship, whether they lived in unsafe community. Remember, in those days, China is still very much a communist country, and therefore community is very, very important. So whether they lived in unsafe community, whether they live in not so close community, whether they lived in unclean community, whether they live in communities that is not very helpful to members or neighbors. In Europe is similar to the one in Britain. If you want to read more about all these, you can look at the references. Now, I then use it to explain health status in old age. And the most important I'm interested at the moment is multimorbidity. And these are the list of chronic conditions that were asked in the 4 surveys that I mentioned. I want to motivate this a little bit. Why study multimorbidity beyond the fact that I've already studied episodic memory, muscle function, depression, sarcopenia, and so on? Beyond that fact that I have studied individual chronic conditions, the reason I want to study multimorbidity is because it is very expensive. If you have 2 or more conditions, often the cost of treating them is more than the total sum of treating each condition separately. That's one thing. Another is because as people age, many of these conditions come one after another. So multimorbidity almost non-linearly adds up. So that's the reason why I'm interested in multimorbidity. Of course, these surveys ask multimorbidity or chronic conditions differently because of the health system difference and the history is different and so on. So let me list some here. Many of them are similar across countries, but there are specifics to each country. As you can see, diabetes, dyslipidemia, hypertension, heart failure, stroke, lung, arthritis, osteoporosis, cancer, psychiatric problem, memory problem, and arrhythmia. That's in America. I will not read the rest to you. The point is simply there are lots of similarities, but there are differences too. So I add them all, and I have 3 alternatives, 3 options of multimorbidity. One of them is 2 or more of these chronic conditions. Another one is 3 or more of these chronic conditions. Another one is simply the count of this chronic condition. So 10 or 11 or 6 and so on. So the first is a binary, whether 2 or more. The second is also a binary, whether 3 or more. The third is a count, and therefore the nonlinear element. So the first and the second is a probit model, fixed effects, and the last is a Poisson model, fixed effects as well. And also part of the sensitivity analysis, I focus on the same exact set of chronic conditions, 9 of them. I focus on that too. Choose 2 or more of the same set of chronic conditions, 3 or more of the same set of chronic conditions, and the count of the same set of chronic conditions. As you can see, it's a bit tedious, but that's what is called sensitivity analysis. Now to the exciting things, which is the evidence. So here it is. The top left, the usual, England, Austria, Germany, Sweden, Netherlands, Spain, that's the first row. And the last row, Latvia, Malta, Romania, Slovakia, America, and China. And the bars are, the leftmost is no chronic condition at all, or 1 chronic condition, and therefore no multimorbidity. The second bar is 2 chronic conditions. The third bar is 3 chronic conditions. The fourth bar is 4 or more chronic conditions. This is based on HRS, ELSA, Charles, and Scher, so the American Health and Retirement Study, English Longitudinal Study of Aging, China Health and Retirement Longitudinal Study, Survey of Health, Aging, and Retirement in Europe. And the total observations of 50 years old in this sample is 78,661. And I use the data vintage May 2024. So just last month, I double-checked every single surveys and downloaded the latest. When I look at this, I'm hugely relieved. Let me bring your attention to the last 2 countries, bottom right, America and China. You can see the huge difference between them. In other words, it is reassuring that there are variation across countries. And the stark variations between these countries makes me convinced that it's a fixed effects model that is appropriate here. For those of you in the econometricians, a random effect wouldn't catch it. And it says a lot more as well, just by focusing on these 2. You can see that in America, even people who are with 4 or more chronic conditions, we have quite a lot of them in the sample. That's how good American health system is to keep those who are severely ill with many conditions alive. Unlike in China. In China, this is the huge, strong effect of survival. If they survived the Great Leap Forward, not many survived that, what we observe now, not many of them reported many chronic conditions, 2, 3, or 4. Of course, it can also be because the country may not have as extensive healthcare to catch, to measure, to diagnose people with as many chronic conditions as in other countries in this sample. The variation across country that you see here shows that there is something to be explained. Now, this is how childhood poverty relates to multimorbidity in all the 30 countries. By now, you see the refrain, the familiar red dashed line above the continuous green line. So the poor, the childhood poor in all these countries tend to have higher probability of multimorbidity. And I use multimorbidity here, 2 or more chronic conditions. I'm not going to show you whether 3 or more chronic conditions will show a different plot or not. I can tell you it's similar. All of you have the tables at the end of my slides. It's all in there. You can check. But here, the same story as you have seen before. The childhood poor have more multimorbidity when they were 70 years old, 80 years old, 90 years old. And it happens all around the world. There are variations in the levels and scope, in slopes. As you can see, for instance, the last 3 in the bottom, Slovakia, America, and China. I have explained the last two earlier, but the same pattern you can see. Why? Why the same pattern is repeated across so many countries and across so many conditions, including a summary conditions of multimorbidity. So something fundamental is going on that goes transcending variation in history and in health systems. You can appreciate the health system of the top left country, England, is very different from the bottom right country, China. What is going on that makes the childhood poor have higher probability of multimorbidity across these ages, across these 30 countries? And the explanations that I can put forward, and I did try to find evidence and test this evidence, is epigenetic. I'm not going to explain a lot of this to you, but you are welcome to read it in the chapter that I wrote and also in the journal, with Dr. Ongono, 2018. When the top left activity or experience during childhood is harmful, like not having clean water, like having financial hardship, like surviving the great leap forward, it matters for methylation. Methylation is the basis or the chemical compound before the gene sequence that turns the gene on and off to be expressed in phenotypic functions or in organ functions. And you can see in the middle, it matters for neurodevelopment, for learning and memory, for learning and processing stress responses. So this is how the activity and experience during childhood can matter for phenotypic expression, organ function, and health status much later in life. Is there any evidence for this in the population? So I went to the American venous blood sample. I got them, and I look at the epigenetic changes in those. There are 16 here. So Buckland way of measuring epigenetic changes, that's a top left, all the way down to Chang way of measuring epigenetic changes, harmful changes that we can see the evidence of in organ function. And I tested it in America, and what I found was among those who were childhood poor, again, the red dashed line, those who are childhood poor, they have more harmful methylation. Among those who are aged 50 to 90. I can tell you that unfortunately, the venous blood sample in America didn't collect multimorbidity data. Only 1% of the venous blood sample are in the multimorbidity data as well. But what I have established here is among those who are childhood poor, they have higher methylation changes as well. So in conclusion, on life course shaping of health in aging societies in the global north and the global south, the world is facing a momentous challenge of aging, with large middle-income nations aging much more rapidly than rich nations. And I want to entertain one implication of this. If China needs lots of social care workers to look after their older people, and they sought the help of social care workers from Africa, which up to now is the source of social care workers for many in Britain, then rich nations can be outflanked in competition for social care workers for older people. So this is a challenge, not only for China, but also for the global north. Life course shaping of health in aging societies, where childhood conditions are construed as poverty, is not only global, but also encompassing I've shown you many conditions. Bringing into one frame diverse poor childhood conditions. Remember, I have 4 columns of many, many different childhood conditions around the world, including lack of running hot water, to financial hardship, to starving to death due to government edict, the Great Leap Forward. This frame can encompass childhood conditions, including wars, Russian war in Ukraine, you can read about it in the chapter that I mentioned earlier, including Hamas-Israel war in Palestine today. The consequences for these children are not only immediate, but, as I have shown you in the last half an hour, long into their future. While the reach is long, the grasp is equally wide. Depression, cognition, inflammation, muscle function, sarcopenia, and multimorbidity in rich and middle-income countries, varying in strength. Before I close, I can tell you some of the things that I'm working on in future works. I am looking at multimorbidity profile. I also look at more policy-related questions, including within a country, does space or place matter? I also am tackling more difficult and important questions, including, do the childhood poor clock up chronic conditions quicker? Do they experience earlier onset? The other things that I'm working on with groups in Guangzhou is quality of life in old age, not only the negative health status, but also quality of life, and harmonize cognitive assessment protocol, and to bring in other countries, Indonesia. And here is an example of multimorbidity profile in Britain. There are 3. And here is an example of policy-related evidence on multimorbidity in England. Thank you very much.